The legacy of Star Fox has been both marvelous and turbulent. While there's no question about the impact the series has had on the industry, it's kind of hard to ignore that the last few games have failed to achieve the same kind of charm and lasting appeal as the first two games. With the release of Star Fox Zero, though, Shigeru Miyamoto is setting out to recapture the magic of Star Fox 64 and provide again the sharp mechanics and unbridled sense of fun that game gave us in such abundance.
Star Fox was one of the first games to use 3D polygons on the Super Nintendo. This blew people's minds and was a great reason for its success. Aside from just the graphics, the gameplay added something new to most on-rail shooters: the ability to slow down and speed up. And unlike most flying games, you don't die when hitting an obstacle. If you hit an object hard enough, your wing will break off, which makes it so you can't use weapon upgrades and handling the craft becomes difficult. The player's decision to take different paths served as the game's easy, normal, and hard mode, but done in an elegant way that made the player feel as though they were choosing the path best for them. This was the game that introduced Falco, Peppy, Slippy, General Pepper, and Andross. Miyamoto and Imamura drew upon Japanese folktales as inspiration for the animals populating the Star Fox universe. Apparently, dogs and monkeys don't like each other very much over there. A sequel to Star Fox was completed but never released. It actually included many elements we see in Star Fox Zero, like the chicken walker, for instance.
Miyamoto made the decision to cancel Star Fox 2 after realizing how much could be done to improve the game with the company's next console, the N64. Even though Star Fox 64 was then developed from the ground up and completely rebuilt from scratch, several ideas originally intended for Star Fox 2 made their way into the N64 version. These included all-range mode, which took the player off rails and allowed for full manual flight in a large arena space, the Star Wolf team, Fox McCloud's mercenary rivals, and multiplayer mode. Star Fox 64 went on to sell 4 million copies, which was a dramatic financial improvement over the first game. It triumphantly planted Star Fox on the map as a powerful IP, and all but solidified its future as a long-running, successful franchise. However, each successive game has proved to be less well received by both fans and critics alike, and the sales figures have suffered as a consequence. Star Fox Command, the last major Star Fox release on the Nintendo DS, only barely broke 500,000 units. At that point, it was made clear that, to some degree, fans had begun to lose faith in the Star Fox brand. And that's where Star Fox Zero comes in. With a promise from the developers that we're receiving a true return to form, Star Fox Zero is now attempting to take the series back to its roots and deliver again the tight, fluent, and contagiously fun experience that fans have come to expect.
The presentation of this game is extremely good. The graphics aren't high-powered or super realistic, but the way it's presented feels very refined. Massive space battles and support from other ships in several of the missions give a very large feel to the game. In previous entries, it's easy to feel like you're the one doing everything, but in this game, you feel a bit more like a piece that's being used in order to win the greater war. I mean, you really do most of the work yourself, but it's nice to be in a universe that feels bigger. Many of the same voice actors came back from the N64 version of the game. It was a solid move by Nintendo, but I feel like somewhere during the past 20 years, these actors have lost a bit of the zest that made the N64 version so fun. The over-dramatic voice acting was a perfect fit for the N64, while the Wii U version seems a bit lacking. It's not bad, I wouldn't say. It fits the Star Fox games very well. It's just not as intense or as fun-sounding as the 64 version. Rob sounds great though. The characters, as they communicate with Fox, show up in a puppet-like fashion. The stop-motion, low frame rate look to them as they're relaying transmissions is an obvious throwback to the N64.
Yeah, I agree with that. As somebody who grew up playing the N64 version like crazy as a kid, the voice acting in Star Fox 64 feels very much like a great Saturday morning cartoon cast. The dialogue is as campy as it could be, but the delivery from the actors was so perfect that it made it all seem fun. There was just so much energy in the performances. They had a punchy, rhythmic quality to them that took them out of the cringe land they could have found themselves in, and became some of the most iconic dialogue in the history of video games. The difference here is in the energy of that delivery. It's just not quite as impactful as it was on the N64. It's not bad by any means, and it definitely feels a lot better than Star Fox Assault, but overall it falls a little flat for me, especially since a lot of the lines come directly from Star Fox 64. A few of the actors do a really great job at reprising their roles. General Pepper and Fox, both great, but Peppy and Falco just don't really live up to their original performance.
You're becoming more like your father.
You're becoming more like your father.
I'm fine. You okay over there, Fox?
I'm fine. You okay over there, Fox?
Looks like they sent a welcoming party. Should we say hello?
I found the target. Try to keep up. My Emperor! I failed you!
My Emperor! I failed you!
The added function of being able to turn into a chicken walker never really appealed to me. Fox is cool flying a ship, the whole tank thing I can get past. When Fox is on the ground fighting, it's awesome, but this whole chicken thing is a bit too much for me. Many bosses need to be defeated using this chicken form that looks ridiculous and takes me completely out of the game. Luckily, there's also a new hovercraft called the Gyro Wing that is a very fitting addition into the game. It can do things the R-Wing just wouldn't be able to otherwise.
I like the variety in the vehicle types in this game. At first I was put off a little bit by the quirkiness of the chicken walker as well, especially since Star Fox 2's wasn't really meant to be a chicken per se, but I like the way it functions and I love being able to transform back and forth.
The story will seem very familiar to those who've played Star Fox games before. James McCloud, Fox's dad, led an assault team that was betrayed by Pigma, a mercenary who was working for Andros. Fox has now teamed up with his father's old pal Peppy Hare, as well as Slippy Toad and Falco Lombardi. Pigma is now part of Starwolf's team, antagonists to Star Fox's mission. It's very clear that Nintendo didn't want to stray too far into new territory with this game. I think they knew that the addition of the Wii U Gamepad was going to be difficult enough for people to get used to, so they played it safe with the way the rest of the game is presented. 3D sound is a fun added component that utilizes the Wii U Gamepad extremely well. The addition of a speaker closer to the player can give a feeling of depth within the sound. The faraway outer space sounds come from the TV screen, while the closer cockpit sounds, such as characters talking to you via transmission, come from the gamepad. This is an effective use of the extra speakers on the controller that most games just don't take advantage of.
I didn't like that the sound was panned to the right and left for exactly the reasons you just mentioned. The gamepad is supposed to represent sound from within the cockpit, while the TV gives sound from outside of it. Having voices come from the right or left on the gamepad depending on the character's relative position is a choice that doesn't make any sense to me, and it feels disorienting. I disabled 3D sound as soon as I could.
The music for this game was very well done, but it doesn't quite feel as great as the scores of its predecessors. This is interesting because the Star Fox Zero soundtrack reuses many songs from earlier games. It does so in a beautiful orchestral manner that would fit very well in a cinematic setting. The composition was a collaborative effort from many musicians that really gave the soundtrack a cinematic feel. The game is a fitting sequel and works together with the rest of the franchise. They didn't take very many risks on this game. The story, characters, and general feel is very familiar. If I was watching someone play this game, I would feel like it wasn't new enough. In playing the game, however, I was begging to switch back to the old control style. It's just too different. It gets easier with time, but the process can be slow and I didn't exactly have the patience for it.
Star Fox has always been a fast-paced arcade-style shooter, excluding adventures of course, but it has never been afraid to try new things. The button layout and motion control schemes in this installment, however, are what separate Star Fox Zero from its predecessors. The general ideas are identical to previous games, but the format is what really threw me off as a veteran of the series. It took me 2 or 3 play sessions to really get a feel for the controls, and once I did, I really started to dig playing it. But there was definitely a bit of a learning curve there for me. I think the thing I had the hardest time getting used to was the fact that the trigger buttons no longer tilt the R-wing or perform barrel rolls. Since the right trigger is now the fire button, they've moved the tilting and barrel roll functions to the right stick. Holding it to the right tilts the ship to the right, and holding it to the left tilts the ship to the left. This feels intuitive for performing quick turning maneuvers, but having to flick the stick twice in either direction to perform barrel rolls never felt right to me. It doesn't seem like it would make much of a difference, but it did for me. I really would have preferred to have the tilt functions assigned to the triggers and fire assigned to the A button, like the traditional controls. But that's not to say that this format doesn't work at all. It's just going to take veterans some time to get used to. And unfortunately, there's no way to customize the button layout, which I found pretty disappointing since you can do that in previous games.
So many of the issues I have with this game would have been fixed by adding a controller customization setting. My right finger cramped up like crazy when having to fire the lasers in rapid succession for an extended period of time. Moving the right stick in different ways than the left one also caused the gamepad to shift for me, which in turn affected my aim. I found it difficult to keep the gamepad still while moving both of my thumbs.
The motion controls are what are going to prove to be the largest barrier to entry with a lot of players. There's been a lot of talk online about being able to either turn them off or limit them in some way, but I'm here to tell you that as Miyamoto confirmed, it's not advisable to try and do so. The game is designed around motion controls, and it can range anywhere from difficult to impossible to play the game without them. Trust me, I tried several methods, one which included starting a mission in co-op mode, but setting the Wii U gamepad off to the side and playing strictly with the Gamepad Pro. It basically worked for the on-rails portions of the missions only, but you can't charge your beam as a second player, and I found I was actually a lot less accurate with my shooting this way. It's just an unfortunate truth that whether or not you want to play with motion controls, you have to in this game. There's no way around it. What I found though is that when playing in the on-rails portions, the easiest way to emulate the old Star Fox experience is to center your target reticle, which can be done easily at any time by tapping the Y button, and simply keeping the gamepad as still as possible. The target reticle will follow the nose of your ship as you turn, just like it did in the old games, but further control of the direction of your lasers is available if you want by aiming with the gamepad itself. It's not a perfect solution, but I did find playing this way was easier for me, which made diving right into the first couple of levels pretty intuitive. The Wii U gamepad serves as a cockpit view for your vehicles, which is always in a centered view for your target reticle. This means that firing while looking at the gamepad screen will give you the greatest sense of accuracy, especially since you can use the gyro sensor to aim efficiently. It's a great idea in concept, something I've actually appreciated a lot in other Nintendo games that have utilized it, like the Zelda remakes on the 3DS, and here it's going to be essential in taking out certain kinds of enemies. However, maneuvering is more difficult in cockpit view because you can't get a full view of your ship. This is essential in a fast-paced arcade shooter to be able to judge whether your vehicle's going to fit through tight spaces, or whether you'll be able to avoid multiple projectiles coming your way. This is what I would consider to be the biggest frustration with Star Fox Zero. It forces you to look back and forth between two screens to perform two separate functions. This wouldn't be a problem in a slower-paced flight simulator, but in this style of arcade shooter, I feel it's a little too demanding to ask the player to perform what would be a two-man job in a real fighter of this kind alone. That's not to say that it's impossible to play, or that it's too difficult to complete. It's very playable, and I was able to finish the game with enough patience and practice, but it's more difficult to control than I would have liked, mainly due to this mandatory two-screen format.
I think this game would have worked better on the 3DS than it does on the Wii U. The 3DS has screens that are much closer together and easier to look between.
Part of this frustration also comes from the fact that every vehicle in the game has a totally different control scheme. The R-Wing controls, as you would imagine, with altitude and orientation all mapped to the left control stick. As the Chicken Walker, however, since it's a ground vehicle, you move forward, backward, and strafe with the left stick, but turn left and right with the right stick. You can't aim with the right stick, that's still managed with the gyro sensor on the gamepad, but simply orienting your vehicle left and right is controlled with the right stick. In the Landmaster though, everything is moved back to the left stick, and that's fine for the on-rails portions, but in all range mode, I found it really difficult to reprogram my brain not to use the right stick to turn from side to side. This is the result of modern first-person shooters, but what I found interesting was that when I looked at my TV screen, turning with the left stick felt fine, but when I was looking at the gamepad in first person, my brain just instinctively wanted to turn with the right stick. Then there's the gyro wing, of course, which moves forward, backward, and strafes with the left stick, but turns left and right, ascends and descends with the right stick. This ever-changing control scheme, which was compounded in complexity for me by having to look between two screens, caused me to feel like I was fighting the controls more often than the enemies during my first run of the game. I got really frustrated by 3 levels in particular, but this frustration mostly came down to being forced to look at the gamepad screen even for sections where difficult maneuvering was necessary. This is because there's an added feature where the left trigger button locks onto enemies. This isn't a lock in the sense that it locks on for firing your charge shot, that operates the way it always has, but rather it locks your camera's orientation onto a specific enemy. This would be fine if it were always optional. However, there are multiple instances in this game where the camera locks on automatically and you cannot disengage that lock. For me, this was horribly frustrating at first because I found it more difficult to maneuver when the camera was locked onto something in the distance rather than being centered on my vehicle. This forces the player to use the gamepad screen for both shooting and maneuvering, and like I mentioned before, maneuvering in first-person mode is not my preferred method. All of this, of course, was how I felt during my first playthrough, but after multiple playthroughs, I've gotten used to how it works, and now I find it pretty easy to use both screens even when I'm forced to lock on.
Auto-lock also happens for in-game cutscenes. I would be watching the cutscene unaware that my R-Wing was still flying in space. I ran into several objects, unable to see where my ship was going.
Almost all of these initial frustrations are alleviated by the fact that the game includes a co-op mode, making flight and navigation a separate task from shooting. Playing this way with a friend can be a lot of fun, though good communication will be necessary in order to not disorient the player with the gamepad who's trying to take aim. When I would do somersaults or other quick maneuvers without letting Casen know first, it would often really mess with his head. However, in single-player mode, it's going to take some time to get used to this new way of playing Star Fox. I was pretty quickly able to get a handle on the R-Wing, but once other vehicles came into play, I started to get more and more embittered. It got to the point where I felt like I was ready to write the game off, but with a little time, patience, and another full playthrough, I really began to understand the controls. And at that point, the game became a lot more fun to play.
I almost feel as if this should have been a 2-player game by default, with the option for a 1-player mode if you must. The game is actually very fun in 2-player mode, and the gameplay goes much smoother when each player only has one screen to focus on. Sure, it was dizzying when you performed a somersault when I didn't know, but the experience was much more fun for me.
Once I was no longer so focused on controlling the game, I found that the level design and difficulty are very well balanced and pretty thrilling in some cases. There's a decent level of challenge here, with room for even more with higher difficulty modes. Hardcore players who want a game with a high skill ceiling will be thrilled with Star Fox Zero, because there's so much going on and so much to unlock, and in classic Star Fox fashion, always a high score that can be broken. If you're a patient player looking for an arcade-style shooter that requires skill to master, then you're going to have a blast with this game. If you absolutely hate motion controls though, then I have a hard time believing this game's going to change your mind. I'll say this, I went into this game having enjoyed motion controls on many of Nintendo's previous games, and I still found it really difficult to understand them on my first playthrough. With enough time, however, I started to get the hang of it, and now I'm having a blast with the game. That learning curve may be too steep for some, but if you hang in there, this game really is a great addition to the series.
I agree that it gets better with time, but the hours it takes to become proficient with the gamepad can take a great portion of the experience that Star Fox Zero has to offer. It just wasn't fun for me. I like motion controls. I like the Wii U gamepad. I like Splatoon and Skyward Sword. I do not like its use in Star Fox Zero. I simply can't recommend it, unless you have the time it takes to tame the controls. It's a good game, I just couldn't get into the forced use of the gamepad.
I agree that the controls take some getting used to, but if you take the dive and allow yourself time to get the feel for them, what lies beyond is a really well-designed shooter with tons of unlockable content to offer. It's a game that takes time to master, but rewards you well for that investment. If you're a patient player looking for a challenge, or you're a die-hard Star Fox fan, then I believe you'll find that this game has a lot to offer.
You beat us again? I'm never gonna live this down.
You got that right.